University and chair of the Leeds Anchors Network. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, an honorary fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and an award-winning author, teacher and trainer. We've got Samira Gomez, and she's the Chief Executive at EMS Tech and Programs Manager at Impact Hub King's Cross, which supports aspiring entrepreneurs to create sustainable and impactful businesses. And as Chief Exec, Samira leads the work to support women in the tech industry by creating opportunities for growth, learning and representation. And finally, we've got Dr. Jo Bibby, and she's Director of Health at the Health Foundation. And Dr. Bibby is responsible for leading the Foundation's Healthy Lives strategy to create the opportunities for everyone to lead a healthy life. She's also a trustee at the Centre for Homelessness Impact and a non-executive director at Rotherham NHS Foundation Trust. So I think you can see we've got a great panel, and I'm going to hand over to Sarah Longlands from CLES, who's just going to talk to us to start the discussion off.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and it's great to be here this afternoon. Thanks very much for the invitation. For those of you who don't know CLES, yes, we describe ourselves as the National Organisation for Local Economies, and our mission, as it was 35 years ago when we were set up, it has always been really about how do you enable local economies to work better for people, place, and more recently, planet. And of course, planet is an increasingly important part of the conversation we are having at CLES, because we believe that a more progressive and a more inclusive approach to economics is also better for the planet. And of course, working at the local level, we believe there's more that you can do to really accelerate progress on the environmental crises than relying on national government alone. But I want to focus the first thing I want to focus on and what I want to say this afternoon is on the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic that we've all been living through over the last 2 years. I want to focus on that first before then turning to thinking about levelling up and how we build a fairer settlement. And then thirdly, talking in a little bit more depth about community wealth building. So first of all, on the pandemic, I mean, COVID-19 is one in a series of economic and social shocks which places have had to deal with over the last 10, 20 years. But it has been a very different type of crisis because of the way it has affected communities and our economy. And in a normal recession, normal inverted commas, lots of people and businesses suffer. But the crisis of the pandemic has created a very differential effect, with many sectors such as hospitality and tourism very seriously impacted, whereas other sectors such as logistics and professional services have done rather better. And we've also seen a change in how we work as a result of the pandemic, with much greater levels of home working, which has geographical implications for our cities and our towns and the way that we use our property. But we've also seen higher levels of inactivity, where people are simply starting to drop out of the labour market altogether. And of course, the government have played a really unique role in this, and the crisis has driven home to us the importance and the interconnectivity of good health and good economies in a way which perhaps we've not really appreciated at a national policy level until now. But most of all, the crisis has really revealed the inequalities of the UK, showing just how unequal a nation we are. And that inequality, as Tom was mentioning at the start, that inequality isn't necessarily about north versus south, or about towns versus cities, or about rural or urban even. Places like Leeds and Camden are wealthy places, successful places, but the wealth is not always shared by all. And so how do we build a fairer recovery which allows wealth to flow more easily in our economy? And so whilst we can use this moment to critique the government's approach and the levelling up strategy, and it'll be great to hear some of the comments on that later on in the discussion, there does seem to be a window of opportunity to ask ourselves how we can use the recovery to reimagine our local economies and how they could work differently to enable better outcomes for people living, working and investing in them longer term. So how do we start to do that? How do we start to build to level up in a different way, in a fairer way, longer term? Well, in his speech to the Convention of the North this week, Michael Gove acknowledged what many of us have known for some time now, that an over-reliance simply upon trickle-down, market-led economics is not enough. And indeed, for many parts of the UK, the response to inequality in recent years has been to rely upon a very boosterous model. That if you get house prices rising to a high enough level, if you get the right level of inward investment, that if you attract enough people with new skills and wages, that will help to turn the dial on inequality. But this approach in itself has left many local places feeling really frustrated, that despite the progress made, and we can see that progress all around us in cities like Leeds and in Camden, many of the challenges remain the same. Communities who have been left kind of fairly untouched by the improvements and sometimes living kind of parallel lives, the same levels of child poverty, of health inequalities and of low pay. And of course, the pandemic feeding into that at times has exacerbated the situation for many people, particularly when you think of education and skills. And Michael Gove's response in the Levelling Up paper acknowledges the flaws of this approach. But he also talks about the need to grow the pie everywhere for everyone. And he also has argued that it's about making sure that economic soil is irrigated, that it's conditioned for growth. And perhaps that's part of the issue here, that the explicit outcome in our economic strategies is growth, because we assume that once we've got growth, everything else will sort itself out. But there's a question for me about what you do in the meantime and what happens if the pie never gets any bigger. And that's the other thing. When you actually speak to local places, when people talk about growth, it's actually a metaphor for something else. It's a metaphor for making things better in people's lives, for human development. And so that's perhaps what we need to focus on as we move through recovery. Because it's not that wealth creation isn't important, but it's a means to an end. And the question that we tried to ask at CLES is, how do you make sure that the wealth you already have flows more easily to the people who need it most? And when new wealth creation opportunities arise, how do you ensure that the pie is shared more equally rather than just gobbled up by those who are most able to take advantage? And we think this requires a different strategic approach, one which we call community wealth building, but it can also be thought of as local wealth building. And it's part of that kind of wider family of heterodox economic approaches, which is trying to think about how we reimagine and rebuild our economy differently. So what is local wealth building, community wealth building? Well, it's a strategic economic approach which is about increasing the flow of wealth and power back into local economies. And the goal is about the creation of an inclusive economy where people are able to flourish, where they're able to live a life that they have a reason to value, and where the economy is driven by a diversity of ownership, of innovation, of creativity. And unlike more conventional approaches to economic development, it seeks to build on the strengths of place and to build wealth from within and minimise economic activity which can extract that wealth and that value from people and place. And it also kind of understands that places are more than just a set of productivity stats on a graph, but a rich and complex story of people, identity and relationships. And fundamental to this approach are anchor organisations in an area. And anchor organisations are those organisations that have a really close relationship to place because of the number of people they employ, because of the assets and land that they hold, and because of the services or business that they deliver. And anchor institutions can play a really important role in terms of how they invest, in how they employ people, in how they purchase goods and services, in terms of the land and assets that they hold and how they use them, and also as a regulator. And that idea of anchor institutions and the importance of collaboration between those institutions is kind of really fundamental to a community wealth building approach, kind of agreeing a future and then mobilising your resources and commitment towards actually making it happen. And it's also about asking the right questions. It's not about how do we create wealth necessarily or how do we drive economic growth, but how do we ensure that the wealth that is here already and the wealth that we create actually reaches the people who need it most so that their lives can be improved. And we often talk about community wealth building as having kind of 5 key levers. in order to kind of really see implementation on the ground. And these are the types of delivery ideas that are being taken forward in lots of parts of the country now. So things like land and property, using the planning system, using the land and assets that we already own to really make sure that the benefits flow into communities. That's the first one. Second, around finance. Often finance is seen as one of the more extractive forms of economic activity in our economy. How do we change that? How do we make sure that investment and finance actually flows more easily in communities, so that small businesses, social enterprise and communities themselves have the chance to access finance to make the change that they want to see on the ground? Decent jobs is a third one. How do you ensure that the jobs that are created are decent, pay a decent wage, provide opportunities for progression and skills development? And trying to dispense with the idea that if you simply provide the jobs, people will come, instead of focusing on making the jobs attractive to the people that are actually there in the first place. Fourthly, around ownership, how do you create a diversity of ownership? Business support, which includes reference to a range of different business models, including cooperatives and social enterprise. And how do you ensure that small businesses, the real lifeblood of our economies, get the help and development support that they need to really grow, rather than focusing solely on inward investment? And finally, spend, really thinking about the money that councils, the public sector and their partners use, and seeing that as part of your local economic development resource, and not as a separate function, bringing your finance together with your organisational mission. And as I said, these are the types of measures that are now being taken forward in many different parts of the UK. In Leeds, we have the Leeds Anchor Network, 13 organisations, over 60,000 employees. And when you get to that level of influence, of economic influence, where you're not just delivering services or thinking about the provision of services on the ground, but you're actually having an impact on the economy, and how can you use that deliberately for the good? And Leeds City Council as well done a lot of work thinking about its role as an employer, as a procurer of goods and services, and as an asset and land holder. In Camden, there's been a huge amount of work done on progressive procurement, on the inclusive business network, and ensuring that there is access to good jobs, and that residents have got access to the skills that they need. So they're just some of the examples of how community wealth building can be delivered on the ground. At a national level, the Scottish Government have now taken community wealth building as a means to deliver on their wellbeing agenda, and they now have a Minister for community wealth building. And in some of the work we've done there's a real emphasis on using it to deliver improvements in the green economy. Also in the Welsh Government, they're using it to deliver on their foundational economy objectives. So I hope that's been a kind of useful overview of community wealth building today. It's an approach that we think can be part of that conversation about how we reimagine and rethink the economy in a much fairer way, longer term. And it's a way of trying to unlock new perspectives and new ideas and opportunities to help us deal with what is not only a difficult crisis at the moment, but will also continue to be difficult with the environmental crises coming close on the heels of the pandemic. In fact, it's already here in many communities. And we hope as well that it can provide some of the answers to the challenges of levelling up in areas like Leeds and Camden, but in other parts of the UK in the longer term. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. It looks like a fantastic panel, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Sarah. That's absolutely brilliant, and a real, I think, a really clear framework to sort of allow us to get into the issues and to test ourselves how we break into this, as we move forward. Georgia, it would be great to start with you and hear from you about, I know you've been passionate about the issues of not just relying on trickle down, and how you engage at that very community level in Camden. Just interested in your reflections on what Sarah's said.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sarah. And I think it deeply resonates with what we've seen and continue to see in Camden. So Camden, for those who don't know it, is a place of real extremes. We we have a huge amount of wealth being created in the borough. The kind of square mile around King's Cross is one of the foremost innovation districts in the world, and we've got huge headquarters, Google, Facebook, and a huge amount being kind of generated for the national economy. But just down the road from that, we also have huge poverty. 43% of children in Camden grow up in poverty. And I remember really starkly at the beginning of the pandemic when schools had to move online. We have a primary school which is maybe 3-minute walk from where the kind of big tech companies are located, and 70% of children there didn't have a device to learn on from home, either because their parents couldn't afford Wi-Fi, or because maybe there was one phone in the household, but they were effectively cut out from learning. So that kind of juxtaposition, people really feel it because they can see the wealth and they can see the way that they are often feel like they're being pushed out of their community. And we've had residents talk about feeling of a kind of an island of poverty in between glass, that new communities are coming in and pushing them out, that they're not seeing the kind of the benefits of that. And I think that's where our role as a council is critical, to kind of use the levers at our disposal to try and make sure that the wealth, the growth, the opportunities coming into place, don't push out our residents, but more importantly, people have a genuine stake in that. And it's not easy, because we talk about levelling up, but the kind of context of the last 10 years has been a real slashing of public sector and local government budget. So a lot of the kind of levers, a lot of things we're talking about have we've lost over half of our budget. I know it's similar for Leeds, but we do have resources. And I think some of the decisions that we've made in Camden are to invest 5 million into good work. So employment support where people are, to ensure that they kind of have that they have access to the opportunities on their doorstep, to kind of play that role of leader of place. We have some hard levers. As a planning authority, we can ensure good quality social housing, genuinely affordable housing, jobs and investment in our communities. Talked about procurement, and as the public sector, we have massive procurement power, but we can also play that convening role to bring other anchors to use their huge procurement power. But I think that we're always pushing ourselves to kind of go deeper and further, and because everything we're doing is not solving these systemic inequalities. It's still the case that you see that those kind of stark inequalities, and the pandemic didn't just expose them, they deepened them. And that it was those on low wages, insecure pay, and insecure contracts, I won't say low skills, because often they were doing kind of deeply skilled work but with low progression routes. We saw that they were the first to lose their jobs or to lose pay, and how precarious many people are living. So there's kind of fundamentals that aren't working in our economy. So I think we have, so we're trying to kind of challenge ourselves. How do we kind of go further? And one of the things we've recently done is set up a new fund to invest in socially impactful businesses and social enterprises. And kind of over the next few years, we want to bring together a community wealth fund which sees that kind of level of investment in those in our community who are offering kind of diverse businesses or businesses or social enterprises or cooperatives that have social value. Because I think the other thing that's really important about a place like Camden is why those people want to be there. Why is King's Cross such a popular place? And that area around it is partly transport links, which have been that's public sector investment, and it's partly because of the kind of energy, diversity, creativity of a place, and that is created often by citizens, but they don't see the value from it. So I think we're really interested in how you really put a value onto some of that kind of local creativity and local economic output as a council, and how we play some of that role to kind of bring together other funders and investors. And we've also been experimenting with a universal basic services trial, which is about digital access. which gives our residents access, who are looking for work, access to a device, Wi-Fi, digital skills, and that has shown to be transformative in supporting people into work, but also helping link them to other parts of the public sector, their communities. And I would love it long term that because you lived in our borough and because this change is happening around it, there were certain kind of entitlements and benefits that you got, so you had a genuine stake beyond just work. And I think that's where we want to get to, and use our hard levers, but I think most importantly our soft levers. And we've learned a huge amount from Leeds about kind of how you play that convening role, and how you deeply kind of work with your anchor institutions, because there's a huge amount. We have over 8 universities. I'm going to forget the exact number off the top of my head, but we have a lot of kind of research and academic power in our place. But I think the real beauty of local government is the ability to bring the kind of power and passion of our communities, and connect to some of the some of the kind of what is the economic power at the moment in our borough, and together create something kind of different, which benefits all, because our communities bring great insight, creativity and diversity, and so there's a double benefit. And then the final thing I'd say is that question of how we measure success. We talked about growth being outdated as a kind of metric on their own, and we've been investing in kind of citizen scientists who have been helping us bring out kind of wider metrics of well-being. What does a successful regeneration and economic outcomes look like for them? And so, as well as the kind of normal metrics, what are we measuring to know if we've been successful, if the kind of regeneration that's happening of Euston around HS2 is actually delivering well-being for our citizens on their own terms.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Georgia. Really insightful stuff, and I think I thought it was really interesting that King's Cross style regeneration was quoted, wasn't it, in the Levelling Up white paper, and it would be worth a PhD in its own right about what that actually meant, and did it sort of push, did it gentrify, did it what economic impact did it have, and who benefited? And I know from working with yourselves how hard you've worked to make sure that it wasn't trickled down, and it was actively making that difference. And it's great to hear the ongoing agenda that you've got there. It's fantastic. Really interested in the universal basic services work as well. Jonathan, it'd be great a lot of this stuff you've driven us in Leeds to look at decent jobs and pay, and the need to link into education and skills as well. Over to you.
Yeah, I was really struck when Sarah was talking about kind of the inequalities, and I think kind of throughout the period of COVID, these aren't necessarily new inequalities we've seen, but what we've seen is just a real light shone on them, and actually a lot of them just widened further. I remember we had a discussion as we were kind of coming out of the worst of COVID and started talking about kind of what economic levers we need to pull. We had a discussion about, do we need to just throw away this inclusive growth and kind of start again from scratch? How do we recover? And actually we realized all of our targets from before COVID were still completely relevant. They were just twice as important now. They've just become that much more significant. It reminded me of as well, I also cover education as well as economy, and in one of our scrutiny meetings we were talking about the impact it had on children, which I think is completely relevant to the economy as well, saying we've all been in the same storm, but we've all been in different boats, and kind of the way we've kind of come through has changed hugely. I kind of what George has been talking about, a lot of that's similar in Leeds. I don't want to repeat too much, but we've been using our own power as a huge employer. In Leeds, we employ 14,000 people, one of the largest employers in the city. And some of that's due to keeping a lot of work in-house, which means you can really kind of control those terms and conditions for your workforce. And it gives us the opportunity to not just kind of go around the city telling other organisations what to do. It means we can be that civic leader and really lead by example. So we're kind of signed up to the Great Jobs Agenda, which started as a TUC campaign, And it's things like, obviously paying the Living Wage Foundation real living wage, but also looking about what makes a good job, whether that's in terms of progression, skills development, kind of even putting in writing kind of that we would never go down kind of fire and rehire. And these are fantastic things to get big employers signed up to. I'm really glad we've got Peter Slee here from Leeds Beckett, who's one of our anchor institutions. And now I think it's about 1 in 7 jobs in Leeds is one of these anchor institutions with these kind of great jobs to make sure that people are employed in the jobs they need to live their lives. And it's been so interesting recently that I don't know whether it's been a shift in what companies are thinking, but we're starting to get smaller companies come to us saying, oh, we want to sign up to these as well. We want to be involved. What do we do? And it is that element of, in a city, if you are, leading by example, people will want to join, and people do join. And I think that's how we create change. That's how we kind of shift. In Leeds, we've got, these massive employers like kind of Sky and Asda, and obviously Channel 4's come, which being a commissioner has meant kind of loads of other people have come to Leeds. And the work we want to do now is to ensure that, it's fantastic that people want to move to Leeds. I'm not from Yorkshire myself. I'm from the wrong side of the Pennines and came over here. So we do want to attract people, but we also want to make sure that those opportunities are here for people born in Leeds. And that's what that kind of inclusive growth is all about. As we grow as a city, as we improve and make lives better, we want everyone to come with us.
Thank you. And I would reflect on, I think inward investment policy is a really interesting area that Sarah mentioned, and that I remember a time in Leeds where I do think that the loudest voices were the ones that were often people who really benefited from the success of the city, but probably the majority of their staff commuted in from other places. And I think there has been a shift in the last decade to much more recognition of how we can get people in the city who live here to benefit much more from that, and to shape policy and be part of it. And it's really tough, actually. It's really hard to achieve that in practice. And when you're looking at inward investment, and I think it's one of those areas that needs further thought. But I also think you're right about, I think there's a definite recognition now from lots of employers about how they need, people are much more interested in their policies and their stand, where they stand on these sort of issues. And outsourcing, now you've got, wage, the sort of real living wage and the commitment to do more from lots of organisations, that the sort of financial reason for doing outsourcing, I think, has gone, really. So I actually think that insourcing thing is going to be much more of the future. And we've certainly found great benefit from having that workforce, particularly during the pandemic, to be able to deploy differently, rather than having a new contractual negotiation with the outsourcer about what they might do for you in this emergency. So yeah, really interesting stuff. We're really indebted to Peter Slee for the pace and scale and success of our anchor network, and he's led that really brilliantly for us. And it's great to have you here, Peter. So over to you.
Gosh, thanks, Tom. It might be helpful then just for me to say a bit about how that works. I'll try and do it quickly. It's sort of an elevator pitch, but in a very tall building. I think what I'd say about the anchor movement is that you start off with, I guess, what you might say is orientation. So what is it that brings us together, and what is it that we're trying to do? And I think nailing that is really important, because there are so many competing agendas, and unless you're speaking the same language and you're funneling into the same thing, then the kind of agglomeration effects of an anchor network will be weakened. So we work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation Community Wealth Building model, and if you take out obviously leadership commitment, it's got 4 real elements to it. The first one is that we all sign up to being an exemplary employer, which means recruiting as much as you can from the local population, having a diversity of employment that reflects your local population, paying fair wages and salaries, having the opportunity to progress, and having a healthy workplace where you can help people to make the most of their health. So that's, I mean, it's an enormous agenda, but as Jonathan said, I mean, we've actually got 15 organisations now, and probably employ 1 in 6 people in Leeds. That's a good start to having an economy full of decent jobs, and having a mind. And it's really interesting, you know, during the pandemic, if I take ourselves as an employer, we didn't claim any furlough, we didn't lay anybody off, and we also managed to avoid anybody getting sick at work. And how do we do that? Well, actually, it was just embodying the principles that we have signed in blood too, I think. The second thing that we've done is obviously sign up to our city's net carbon zero plans for 2030. And as soon as you realise that for all of us, it's scope 3 emissions that are key, unless we work together on travel to work, on purchasing, on work habits, then there's no way that and support each other on that, there's no way we can make the real progress that we would need. So that's an interesting one. The third one, which Sarah mentioned, is purchasing. Between us, we purchased to the tune of £2.5 billion. When we began the anchor movement, less than a quarter of our discretionary spend was spent in Leeds, and now it's 55%. So the knock-on effects of that are potentially huge. And, you know, if I say within our own organisation, what we have discovered is that it's not enough to purchase locally. You need to work down the supply chain to support your organisations. So you can support them also to purchase locally, to have good employment practice, to maintain the kind of standards that you want of a supplier. But equally, being a university, our business school can work with them too. And 2/3 of our spend in the region now is with small and medium enterprises. And the prospect of taking on a large client means growth possibilities, but managing growth as a small or medium enterprise is often something that causes them to collapse internally. So then how can we use our role as an anchor to build support around their development? So that's a critical one. And then finally, there's how we deliver our services more effectively to meet the needs of local people. And this for me is where win-win is important. If anchor work as an organisation, if your anchor work is just seen as, I suppose, charity work, then it's all going to fail. So there has to be something in it for the organisation beyond its reputation. And for us as a university, this is amazing. All of our students need practical experience to become employable. And working with local organisations and local people, some of whom can't afford to pay for the kind of support that we can provide them, enables our students to get a great education, and local people and local organisations to gain tremendous benefit. And then hopefully that then feeds back into our students, many of whom are first generation and hoping to make their way up the social and economic ladder, and then can be funneled in through our relationships as purchasers into jobs, new jobs that are growing in the city that we've helped to create by our actions. So it's a virtuous circle. So that's how we try and work. Animating that is really interesting. So we started by asking everyone to sign a pledge and saying where they stood on these issues and where they hope to get to. And we're repledging now. And so in March, we'll have much stronger commitments and hopes for our outcomes. And secondly, it's how we work together so that 1 and 1 and 1 makes more than 3 by combining our skills and our knowledge and our experience. And then thirdly, and I don't think we're quite here yet, is could we focus our energies on the least advantaged in our society? Could we concentrate, for instance, on the 6 super output areas, that have got the most disadvantage? And that requires a different level of commitment and focus that I think we're beginning to build up to as a challenge. So I hope that helps as a kind of starter for 10 about what we're trying to do.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Peter. Samira, it's great to have you here, and really enjoyed reading about the work that you've done on the Impact Hub at King's Cross, and also the work with the Nordic tech sector. Really fascinating, and some parallels actually with some work we're doing in Leeds. But it'd be great to hear from you about your perspective on Sarah's presentation, and particularly the issues about how we make sure that wealth follows through to hit every part of the community. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. I think everything Sarah has said, and the other panelists as well, have kind of hit the nail on the head. I think what I can add is kind of my work around smaller business in particular, because we see quite a lot of them coming through our programs at Impact Hub King's Cross. And we do also have particular programs supporting Camden and Islington businesses specifically. And I think something that's sometimes kind of forgotten is that smaller businesses do drive the economy. You kind of see all of the numbers essentially show that the more small businesses that you have, the kind of better the economy is. But small businesses don't always get to take part of that wealth that we were talking about earlier. You see growth, you see that the numbers are rising, but it's not trickling down in the same sense. And I think something I've seen in particular with the kind of last few cohorts that we've had is that, as Georgia mentioned, COVID obviously has showed and kind of deepened as well the gaps that we have in society. And a lot of the small businesses that we have come in are very community focused. They're either kind of focused on hiring them or about serving their community as well. And you see that they are all very well equipped to serve their community. They have those local connections. They know exactly what kind of support they need, and they are ready to do that support. The only problem is that they don't always have the resources to do that, and those kind of that wealth and that support doesn't always trickle down. So something we've tried to work with a lot is helping them support themselves, and that kind of community aspect and that co-ownership comes in a lot, because running a business is very difficult. Even though I do support people to set up businesses, I kind of always caveat that with saying it really isn't for everybody. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money and a lot of energy. But if it is something that you want to do, it isn't always something that you need to do on your own as well. It is something that you can bring in other people with you, and you can together kind of create those solutions and create that support. It doesn't always mean necessarily that you're running the same business and doing the exact same thing, but kind of connecting forces in that way, the same way we see governments and companies do, and the way that they should and need to be doing as well. And those are kind of the main things I've been seeing as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Samira. Absolutely right. And I think that small business part of the picture, which when you look at the statistics makes up, as you said, the majority of the economy. But sometimes I feel our economic development policy has not really been geared to that fact. And yeah. I think it's an interesting time for us with the LEPs, being reviewed, and the move to where we go next. Certainly our leader, James Lewis, is keen for us to, be a stronger voice for the LEP to be a stronger voice for smaller businesses, because the bigger ones in a way have their own roots in, through other ways. But yeah, really fascinating. And Joe, it's great to have you on the call, and we heard from Sarah and others about how the pandemic has really hit, shone that laser beam on inequalities, and it's going to be here for a while as well. Even though we return to what will be new normal, COVID's going to be part of it. So those inequalities are going to continue to be under real pressure, aren't they? But it'd be great to hear from your perspective.
Great, thank you, and thanks for a chance to join this panel. For people who aren't familiar with the work of the Health Foundation, we're an independent charity and we do work to improve health and healthcare across the UK. And the work that I lead is very much looking at how wider determinants of health, housing, economy, community, education and so on can be used as ways of ensuring people have the best start in life and live long and healthy lives. And I think first, just so to respond to Sarah's presentation, first thing I want to do is a bit of a shout out to CLES as an organisation, and in fact the influence they've had in the healthcare sector, because probably about 4 years ago now the Health Foundation started working with CLES on the concept of the NHS as an anchor organisation. At that time we were seeing a lot of councils embracing the anchor mission, universities, but not so many NHS organisations, and on the back of that work I can say it's had an enormous impact. It's now written into policy guidance and so on, and is something that I know comes up regularly with NHS organisations and their strategies. So I think it's really great the reach that CLES has been able to have on influencing this debate across the UK. I think the thing that really resonated with me with what Sarah was saying is, of course, this link between health and wealth. We've seen how a health crisis of COVID could turn into an economic and wealth crisis, essentially for the country and for individuals. But I think what's important to recognise is that this is something that it's not just there for the pandemic. The levels of ill health in this country are going to be a massive brake on our ability to recover. And just to give an illustration of that, the proportion of the working age population that have a work limiting condition varies from 21% of the population in Hartlepool to 10% in Wokingham. So if you just think about that in terms of the sort of critical mass of people in local places that are able to participate in the local economy, there's big variation there, and it will have an impact on the ability to recover. And so I think we can't continue to think about health and wealth as different things. We need to think both about how the way in which we develop our economies are done in ways that are inclusive, that create good quality jobs for people, build the right skills for people who presently have some of the lowest prospects in terms of life expectancy. And we need to recognise that unless we actually do something with this challenge that we have around ill health, then we're going to have this break on our economy. And I think one of the challenges that I'd sort of pull out is that we have a lot of ill health kind of baked into our system. Sort of ill health is something that emerges later in life, but essentially the conditions for it are being laid. People talk about the first 1,000 days, the first 5 years of life are also important, but equally, our early working life. And we can see that so many of the markers of risk factors of poor health really are going in the wrong direction. So I think there has to be a really concerted effort on how we think about the ways in which we rebuild the economy, and making sure particularly that we're developing sectors that produce goods and services that are what people want and need, and are going to be contributing to people's long-term health, not just in the kind of conditions and work that it creates, but the products and services that are being created. So I think it's very easy to see how the kind of economic development agenda can kind of go in one of two ways. It could go down a route that really does build the fabric of local communities, invest in small businesses, create good jobs for people, but equally, there is a risk, obviously, that it kind of gets sort of channeled into sectors and industries that ultimately kind of don't embed the wealth back into communities, but also don't kind of embed the conditions that are needed for people to have healthy lives. So I think this agenda that so many councils are embracing, I think is really promising to see.
Thank you, Joe. That's been a really good set of responses to Sarah's reflections, and I just encourage anybody who's on the call to use the chat to ask any questions. Chris has made the point on the chat that the pie has got bigger, but the if you like, the wealthiest have been the main ones who've taken advantage of that, if you like, and benefited from that. And I was, as Chris, I read that from Chris, I was just reflecting on if you take housing policy as an example, and having worked with Camden now for a while, we you see in London the impact that housing policy has on levels of poverty, I think much more disproportionately than you do in a place like Leeds. Even though Leeds has that as a factor, it's so much more of a factor, a dominant factor in London. We have a tendency outside London, I think, to have a combination of factors that adds to that. And I'd be really interested in the panel's views about, if it's, that issue of where, who does benefit, and is there too much benefit? And do we take full account in policy of, if you think about housing policy, about who, when new initiatives are produced, like the energy policy recently, that has a differential effect depending on whether you own a house, whether you rent, whether you, what your financial position is. So quite interested in that whole area. And the big house builders are a bit, I think, part of that model whereby, if the economy changes, they change their balance sheet and their strategy, and they don't build as many houses. But then we still have the big problems that of poverty that come through. So yeah, I'd be interested in anybody who'd like to come in on maybe that issue about, the pie does get bigger, but we don't seem to take account of community wealth approaches in policies like housing. Anybody like to come in on that one? Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, on the housing point, because I think that is the kind of key issue driving inequality in central London. And I think what we've seen in Camden is increasingly a real kind of change in our community. So we now have a lowest birth rate in the country in Camden, and it's not because nobody in Camden is having children, it's because when they do, they can't afford to stay in Camden. And the average house price of a home in Camden is £800,000. It's just completely unaffordable to buy for anyone but the most wealthy, or somebody who's lucky enough to have inherited generational wealth. And there was a generation who did see their house prices go up dramatically, and that has created a kind of intergenerational inequality. The change in housing benefits and the cap has meant that the private rented sector in my borough is pretty unaffordable. There's very, very few places that you can get that sit underneath the housing benefit cap. So the kind of only affordable form of housing is social housing, which is about a third of the housing, but that drives overcrowding and huge competition for a very kind of limited supply of housing. So I mean, I think these are massive issues. I think that there is a kind of, there's a policy decision that you have to care. You have to have a national government that thinks it is important to have mixed communities in every part of the UK. And I think that some of these policy decisions is an idea that it's not important to have a mixed community in the heart of London. And I think you lose a huge amount there if you look at kind of cities like Paris, where you have seen poverty pushed to the outskirts. That has a massive impact on opportunity, on kind of access to jobs, and just your kind of social mix. So I think kind of the great asset of a city like London has always been its social mix and its inclusivity, and that is definitely under threat. I think that there are the kind of one thing you do have is, as a council who had generations before me were very forward looking, they bought up a lot of Camden, which means that we see as a community asset. So we are using the land value in Camden to build some private housing, that we use the proceeds to invest in council housing. And that's the only way we've been able to deliver good quality council housing, because we're just not seeing the investment from central government. So we built 500 family-sized homes, and we will build over 1,000. So that does make a difference and is a form of community investment. But I think that a lot of the kind of national policies make this difficult. And I think the one I'd really flag is the way that land is valued, because what we see is developers will buy land based on a kind of speculative value that can be created from it, rather than what can be created from it with all the planning places, social and affordable housing in place. And that means that you have, drives bad behaviour. You have irresponsible developers who will pay too much for a site and then kind of at the end of a process use viability to not deliver affordable housing. And I think it would make a massive difference if we change the way that land was valued in this country. I think we're long overdue looking at the council tax system, which is regressive, and everybody's been too afraid to look at for a long time. But I think that would also make a difference. And I think that there's a kind of myth that councils are stopping development, but actually, if you look at it, there's so many planning permissions that have been given that aren't built on. So I think kind of after a certain point, we should have better powers to be able to intervene and bring assets into use. And then the final thing I'd say is that I think because London is a good place to invest, we increasingly see properties being used as investment, as places to invest money rather than places to live. And I don't know the answer to this, but we've put in a kind of empty home extra council tax, but I would like to see policy that makes that much more difficult, and means that housing that is built is housing that people get to live in.
I just add as well on the point of, I agree with everything, and I think on the point of kind of businesses and the economy of businesses as well, I think it's quite similar there as well. There's only a certain pie, and certain companies and certain sectors have kind of the bigger shares of that pie. So even when you see governments and people putting money into businesses and saying, okay, we're going to try and boost up the economy, a lot of that just goes to the bigger businesses. And you see that they don't invest as much back into the community as the kind of smaller businesses and the more local businesses do as well. And I think there as well, there needs to be a change in kind of how we, as we mentioned earlier, how we kind of view growth and how we view growth of businesses and how we invest, but also where we put that money, how much of that money is actually going to end up going back into the community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, do you want to come in?
It was just to really, I think we're all in the kind of violent agreement on this point, but I think I think there's a question there too for me about the planning system, and then the planning system at a national level is always seen as a kind of its job, its role, its function is about facilitating growth and facilitating the market. But in somewhere, particularly in parts of London, you need different levers, and you need different tools to be able to make sure that what you are creating, what the market is doing, isn't necessarily starting to undermine your diversity and the things that have actually made you successful in the first place. And I don't think the way in which the national planning system operates necessarily provides you with those tools or those levers, which allows you to really kind of intervene to try and deal with some of the real kind of negative impacts or unintended consequences. And I think there's also something about the way, this has been talked about. I know that it's something the government are aware of. We have such a small market in terms of volume house builders as well. And a lot of the time, I remember talking to a developer about this, and they were saying, we don't build houses, we sell houses. That's our function. And very often it's to service what can be quite a largeable debt in their own bank account. So there's something about how do you provide alternative methods of actually delivering housing on the ground, which really kind of meets the needs of people. And I think that is about a community wealth building approach, about diversification, about what Georgia was saying about using your own assets and land to try and intervene. But even then, you still need the regulatory powers from a national level to kind of really take that action to stop people from taking advantage of the land values in a speculative way, which isn't in the public interest. And at the end of the day, that's what this should be about, the public interest, and making sure that everyone has a fair share.
Yeah, that meets the point made on the chat about how much can we do ourselves versus the framework we're working within, which is a really good point. Councillor Pryor, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the housing market is just completely broken across the country, and I think there are things we can do locally to kind of mitigate against that. But ultimately, we are mitigating against a problem that's bigger than all of us. I see some of this in my partner's from Brixton down in London, and when chatting to some of his family down there, it's just really clear that the level of kind of new people coming in, as Georgia said, where people are seeing London as somewhere to invest rather than anything else. People are getting priced out of places that they've lived for generations. But equally, then there's a bit of a fear from people who they may have a council house. They don't want to leave that council house to follow a job opportunity somewhere because they're terrified that they'll never be able to get back should they want to. So actually, the housing market is having a huge impact on other people's choices in life and what they want to do. In Leeds at the moment, I'm so proud that we've got the largest house building programme we've had in decades. I think, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think something like 1,500 council houses we're building. But it's something we've got to be really cautious of making sure those are spread right across the city in every area. But equally, this is, look, I'm one of these millennials that is getting told, if I just cancel my Netflix subscription, I'll be able to afford a house. And it's just, there's no acknowledgement nationally of just how far the gap between wages and the cost of housing has just grown and grown and grown. And I think we need to see more of a focus on that nationally, even if there are bits we can do locally as well.
Absolutely. Peter, there's a couple of points on the chat about questions about how we can, whether businesses have been interested in the Anchors network, and also the role of the social enterprise third sector, in terms of the maybe some of the matching up that could be done through that. Any perspectives on that?
Yes. There are big businesses. I mean, I should have said earlier that the organisations in our Anchor network are all, they're not all public sector, but they are all public service facing. So we have hospitals, colleges and universities, public utilities, British Library, and government departments like DWP and I hope soon another couple as well. So businesses have expressed an interest in the movement, but don't like quite so much the Joseph Rowntree Foundation focus on community wealth building. You could say, well, you can't be a member if you don't do that, or you can do what we're doing and saying, yeah, let's get a movement together that works for you. And then you can make the contribution that at this stage you feel able to make. So that's running in parallel to what we're doing. And we'll see how that develops over the next little bit. Again, we do have an overarching organisation in Leeds called Leeds Acts, which brings together very large numbers of organisations that you would call third sector. But you've got to remember, if we go back to our framework, how do we become good employers? How are we contributing to net zero? What are we doing through purchasing to transfer wealth outwards into the key parts of our community? And how can we align our services better to the needs of the community? There is a limit to what you can do with working with smaller charitable organisations. And that's where I think mission-based work is important. I mean, I'm pretty taken with the ideas that are underpinning the drive towards integrated care systems. And one of the critical elements in that is, how do we get the vast number of voluntary organisations that the care system is wholly dependent on brought into the fold and aligned and supported better. And it feels to me that that's the kind of approach that would work more effectively than the one that we have now. So, but I'm trying to get us walking fairly confidently before we start sprinting off in a range of other directions.
Thanks, Peter. Joe, there's a really interesting point from Becca on the chat about how do we bring narratives on community wealth building and community well-being closer together. Have you got any perspective on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose there's kind of several answers to that. I mean, one is about how organisations that have a big presence in place, whether they're universities, councils, hospitals and so on, do build those links in with their communities. And I think this, you know, it was really interesting hearing what Peter was saying about the kind of mutual benefit of actually by building the links into local communities, it also then provides opportunities for work experience and so on. And I think hopefully what we'll start to see, for instance, in the NHS is that as people start to really tackle some of the issues around inequalities of access and outcomes from NHS services, through doing that, they start to build much more meaningful relationships with local communities. So I think there's something about just that kind of value and behaviour approach that and the mindset to how these relationships are built, and really understanding what it is that communities want and need from these big anchor institutions and how they can contribute, rather than it kind of being a one-way sort of thing of, well, we've got some jobs, would you like them? I think there's a sort of building that mutuality is really important. I mean, the second thing is that there is a lot of work done in this space. Public Health England, before it kind of was folded, did a really excellent report looking at the relationship between inclusive economies and health and well-being, kind of created a set of metrics that people can use. So I think there's something about, on that more technocratic side, how do you make sure you know what good will look like and that you can measure it, so that there's a purposefulness to it. Because I think it's very easy, you know, to get into the sort of aspiration space, saying things that sound positive, but it has to be followed through with some of that hard measurement. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a really important point on the chat, Samira, about the role of hubs, community hubs, and how they fit in. How does it feel to you? Do you operate within that wider network of third sector organisations and social enterprises, or how do you see that part of the agenda fitting together?
So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And the way that we do it is Impact Hub King's Cross is part of kind of a larger organization. So there are Impact Hubs pretty much all over the world. I mean, there are specific numbers, but that I don't remember from the top of my head, but there's about 100 ones in at least 80 different countries. And I think scattered out pretty much in all of the continents. And so I think one thing is that depending on the country and the city, obviously the situations can be very different, and the solutions to tackle those situations and those problems are also very different. However, there are still a lot of similarities, and so a lot of knowledge that we can take from each other. And I think especially with the hubs in our specific country, so here in the UK, there's especially a lot of different, a lot of knowledge, but also a lot of opportunities as well that we can share with each other, which I think is very important. And I think it's kind of part of that community wealth building that we also see here today between Camden and Leeds as well. We don't have an Impact Hub in Leeds just yet, so maybe somebody wants to open that up. But I know that we have one in Bradford and Inverness as well. So we're able to share a lot of that knowledge and also come together and work together through different programs. But even across Europe and across the world as well, we've had our program Feeding the City, which supports sustainable food businesses. And so we've been able to kind of take that concept and that structure that we've had here in London and move it to other countries in Germany, for example, where they're able to run kind of the same program, obviously customizing it a little bit for their population and for their community. But yeah, I think it's very important, and I think kind of a lot of what we've said today is that you can try and do everything on your own. There's a lot that you can try and do on your own. You can cancel your Netflix subscription, you can try and set up a specific company or whatever it is, but there's only so much that we can do on our own. At the end of the day, we need the support both from the government and from other governments, organizations, but also from other people and from other organizations as well, both for that knowledge sharing, but also sharing resources and sharing support as well, and kind of being able to amplify that impact as well.
Absolutely. We have good friends in the Impact Hub in Bradford. Cameron, who runs it, works really well with us, and we're blessed in Leeds, I've got to say, with a really diverse and strong third sector who've been hugely challenged through austerity and through the pandemic, but we couldn't have got through the pandemic without them, and I know that Georgia and Jenny in Camden have felt the same. Jonathan, do you want to? Interesting, isn't it, about the that issue of the role of the third sector and some of those larger third sector organisations, and just thinking about the culture grants that we still run, and that actually are really pivotal to how we create these opportunities for people, for communities to get involved and engaged and achieve their potential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really why I'm really pleased that as part of my portfolio we've got economy and culture together. I think often it's overlooked how kind of irrevocably linked the two are. We have kind of our Arts at Leeds grants, and we know that for every kind of pound we put into the cultural world, it's returned 6 times over, and it boosts not only that cultural sector, but it boosts our hotels and our bars and restaurants, and it also kind of it gives a city and an area its character as well. I think it's something we really learned from over the pandemic. Was the first thing people turned to were different forms of art, the kind of turn to music and film and TV, and it's what makes us human to a large extent. And I think too often culture's kind of just been dismissed as this sort of nice little extra. And often when there have been council cuts, it's the first thing to go. When there have been school cuts, it's sometimes the first thing schools get rid of. But actually, the value is enormous. We've got this fantastic scheme called In Harmony, which is from Opera North, which I believe is the largest opera company in the north of England. And they go into one of our primary schools, one of the most deprived primary schools in the city, giving them instruments, doing singing with these kids. And it's not only improved kind of levels of mental health, and it's just fantastic art for art's sake, but their attainment in maths and English has also shot up as well. There's a huge value in culture, and as great as and as fantastic as we want it to be for young people, we want that to be throughout all ages. We applied. I can't remember when it was. I think 2015. Leeds was bidding to be the European Capital of Culture. Sadly, we were disqualified as Brexit kind of loomed, and they said there wouldn't be any UK cities there. And in a very Yorkshire way, we just declared ourselves the winner anyway, and are now having a year of culture, Leeds 2023. And seeing this come together is so exciting. Having all these events where we're trying to get to every part of the city, trying to involve everyone, but also seeing other companies that aren't necessarily linked to 2023 at the moment saying, yes, we want to celebrate Leeds culture at the same time, we want to hold events. And some of the projections for how this is going to impact our economy, how it's going to impact jobs, is phenomenal. And before the pandemic, it was like, yes, this will be a nice boost to our economy. Post-pandemic, Leeds 2023 and this year of culture is actually becoming pivotal to recovering our economy, and just seeing how much those are linked is fantastic. And following on the back of this, we've seen Bradford, our neighbours, now applying to be the UK Capital of Culture, and they should definitely win. It's a fantastic city. Our other neighbours are having a year of music. We're just seeing more and more celebration, and just that way of boosting the economy is going to be fantastic.
Great. Now we've got about 10 minutes left, and if everybody is brilliantly sticking to 2 minutes, you can each have a sort of final comment before we hand back to Jenny. So Sarah, would you like to go first? Maybe just one final reflection from each of you.
Yeah, sure. So I think the thing that's kind of come through to me while I've been listening to everybody, and it has been such a kind of interesting conversation, but I think that point, I think it was Samira mentioned it, and probably someone else did, but there's something about mindset in all of this, that and then also that link to what Peter said about relationships. And I think often particularly in economics, economics and economic development sometimes has been understood in quite a linear way, where some of the kind of wider issues around inequality, whether that's in terms of health or skills or places, it seems somehow outside the remit of economics, and somehow that it operates in quite a pure environment, and politics and wider society kind of takes care of it itself. And I think there's a sort of a way of doing things in economics and economic development which has kind of been underpinned by national government, I think, to a large extent, particularly over the last 10 years, where there's we've had a huge level of cuts, which is kind of taking capacity and taking expertise and taking confidence out of the system to do things a bit differently. And also I think there's a fear often in public policy of risk and challenge, because of the stakes are often really, really high. And COVID, I suppose, has disrupted some of that, and so that's part of that kind of window of opportunity, I think, to try and think about, well, how could we do things differently? And the final point I want to make just on that is that to help us create that kind of environment, to help us create that different type of economy, I think activity, creativity, ideas, the stuff that Jonathan was just saying there about culture and engaging people differently and celebrating places, I think that is vital, because it helps to disrupt some of these current ways of thinking and these current kind of paradigms, if you like, which stop us from trying different things. And I know from some of the research I've done previously that if you talk to some of the, I'd be interested in Samira's thoughts on this, but if you talk to tech entrepreneurs in some of the kind of tech clusters in Manchester or in London, they say, what we need is not necessarily more coding experts, but we need people with ideas, with creativity, who understand about philosophy and have done music, and those are exactly the things that are getting sort of really kind of narrowed in education and skills, and where the money is kind of disappearing from. So I think for me, something about mindset and about how we kind of challenge that.
Brilliant, thank you. Samira?
Yes. 2 minutes. I'm never good on the spot with the timer. But it's been a great conversation, and I think just kind of following on Sarah's thread of thinking differently, I think, as I've mentioned before, I think the government and kind of institutions need to do a lot more in investing a lot more in smaller businesses and in local businesses, not necessarily small ones. But I think until that happens, we kind of need to look at different ways that we can help these companies and these entrepreneurs fund themselves and set up their companies, whether that is looking at kind of moving money around between friend groups where everybody puts in £100, and each month each person gets £500, and then that moves around each month, just helping people get a little bit of money to set things up, or kind of coming together to build things. I think this is kind of the time in our history, I suppose, where I think things are going to start changing. I think the government is going to get a little bit more pressure in kind of where they're actually putting the money. But I think as communities as well, we're going to start looking differently at what we can kind of take ownership in doing and how we can invest differently as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Peter?
Nearly had to put my pound in the jar there. Let me just tell you about one project that I think is absolutely fantastic in Leeds, as part of the Leeds Anchors Network, and that's the development of the new hospital that's being built in the city. It's a £600 million development, and the whole notion of social value has been applied to the purchasing. And so the engineering and building companies are local. They a lot of the materials that will be used will be sourced locally. Patient groups have been involved in designing the hospital so that it meets their needs and reduces barriers to engagement. It's been designed as a hub for the development of technical innovation, and so we're, our own university is testing patient sensors and things there at the moment. And it's something which I think might not have happened in the same way if we hadn't all been together, and to take Sarah's point, in a group, sharing ideas about how we can use our assets more to the benefit of the local economy. And if it's not £600 million, but I mean, our economic impact as an institution in the city has just been calculated by a consultancy at being 1.4 billion a year. And so our complete focus is, how do we get more of that directed to where it will make the most difference, which is Sarah's point. But we now have a methodology for that. We have a way of working, and over the next 3 or 4 years, the benefits will snowball, I think, from this approach into our economy, and hopefully, I think, much more of it will be directed for those who need it most.
Great, thank you, Peter. Jo?
Yeah, I think just in closing, the thing I was going to mention that hasn't come up actually is investments and how investments are used. So we've got, councils, presidents, universities all have huge pension funds. And I think there's a big question about how those investments are used. If they go into the kinds of businesses that we're saying basically just extract wealth from communities, then, we're not really maximising the opportunity from those big sources of funding. And there are organisations such as Share Action now who are looking at how investor action can be used to promote some of the sort of value-based employment approaches that we're talking about, things that have positive benefit on climate or on food supply chains. So I think one of the things to throw in the mix here is how big organisations are using their pension funds.
Brilliant, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think what's really clear is, there's a lot of stuff that some councils have been doing for years. I mean, Leeds, I'm so proud of stuff we've been doing for a long time, but hasn't necessarily been called community wealth building. And it just seems that nationally that there's a real movement for this now, and it's great for Leeds and Camden and others to be right at the forefront of that. And you can really sell the advantages. There's not just a almost like a moral argument to it. There's an economic one as well. Tom, you mentioned briefly kind of the benefits we had of having a huge workforce that's in-house. We found this was great when Leeds had floods in 2015. It meant we had a massive workforce. We could just shift to dealing with kind of one crisis. During the pandemic, when we needed to kind of pack free school meal boxes for kids, we just had a workforce. We could almost just direct everyone towards doing that. Then, there's a huge benefit to it that I think more and more places are realising. And I think it's up to us as almost the being right at the front of this to push it across the country.
Absolutely. And then Georgia, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a wonderful discussion. I have 3 really quick points. I think the first is kind of in response to Becca's point. I think there's something really important about people's own kind of power and agency. And often we kind of think about that sometimes in communities, but actually that's just as important in the economy, whether that's through the trade union movement, new cooperatives, or different models. But it feels like people being able to shape the economy is critical, and so it's not just us as the local state kind of defining it, but actually when we look at the outcomes from investment, that is defined by communities, because them feeling ownership and a stake of what's happening around them is critical. So I think that is a real guiding light for us, and something we think about all the time. I think the second bit is there's a huge amount we can do as local places, and we've heard today like the different kind of the different work Leeds and Camden and then many other places around the country are doing. And I think that we have more power than we think. I think Jonathan was exactly right when he talked about the power of example. You know, when we became a living wage borough and signed up to the Ethical Care Charter, that had a ripple effect in the community, and that this anchor work, the soft power we have is huge. And we've used a missions-based approach to bring partners and coalitions together. But if we combine that with community power, we can do a huge amount. But when Tom, a dear friend of Camden, came to Camden, I think he noticed that we were trying to solve all of our problems in Camden. And actually, I think the importance of conversations like this and new coalitions is critical. And there are some, there's a certain point where we do need national change, whether we're talking about land value or council tax or business rates, or some of these big issues does require national change. And I think that's why the work we do together locally to kind of work out what national change would unlock this community wealth approach in a much deeper way, those are the things we should be pushing for, and I think we have a real powerful coalition to do that.
Brilliant. Can I just thank the panel who've been absolutely brilliant. That's been really fascinating, and I certainly have got loads of food for thought in my mind about what we should be doing more of. And can I thank Jenny and Lynn as well, who've been helping us while we've been talking. So Jenny, back to you.
Oh, thank you. Only going to be a few moments. I think the panel summed everything up really powerfully, but I was just going to reflect that during the conversation, there were quite a lot of challenges about what we can do now, how we can power share. And I thought there's some really good examples. I think Peter was saying there's, very strong messages about what we say and what we mean around good work and using our power around procurement. And then a huge discussion around campaigning for what we see, the more complicated issues into the future. And I thought the housing discussion was particularly interesting, but I loved the idea of using celebration to boost the economy because of all of the issues around mental health and us coming together. I know you're doing a lot of work on that in Leeds in particular, but I thought it really linked to what people were talking about the power of local identity and sense of belonging, and that gives you power. And I think Georgia and Tom in their work during the pandemic both showed us in particular how if we, with our partners and our local communities, speak with one voice to government about reimagining a different model for the future, we're really powerful, and we can move more quickly. And I think that's what we're left with here, is that kind of challenge of that reimagining. We know we stepped up and moved at pace during the pandemic. So I guess the question back to us all as leaders is how are we going to power share on community wealth building quickly to show an alternative model to government as we move forward? So I want to thank everybody, as Tom did, and remind people that this is recorded and you can see it on the Camden YouTube channel forever. And that we'll write up the notes as well. And we did say we're going to try and plan a kind of in-person event around this critical subject at some point in the future. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Hi, just wanted to thank you both. Hi, I'm Mike from Leeds. Just wanted to thank you both ever so much for that. That was brilliant. I know you're in touch with colleagues in Camden to sort out anything in the back office that we need to. But yeah, thanks again. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Thank you. See
See you later.
Right.